I'd like to welcome everyone to our Dairy Foods virtual office hours here for September 19th. Um, Great to have everybody here. And this is an extension of what we were doing before for our COVID office hours, but today we're going to be taking it up and we're going to be talking a little bit more about Cronobacter to Monkeypox. What are the current issues in dairy food safety? We're going to have a great talk coming here from Martin Wiedmann. We also have two other panelists joining us today. We have Nicole Martin, who is the Assistant Director of the Milk Quality Improvement Program, and we also have Dr. Aliosa Trimick, who is an Extension Specialist here in our Dairy Division, and I'm Sam Alkane, an Associate Professor here in the Department of Food Science with a focus on dairy fermentations. And so with that, I'm going to kick it off and pass it over to Martin to kind of get us going on this interesting topic.
Sounds good. Thanks, Sam. Let me share my screen here. So I'm going to do sort of a broad sort of overview of some of the current issues in dairy food safety and related. Starting out with one which, some of you might not be considering that current anymore, which is Cronobacter. Moving on to monkeypox, sanitizer, and then maybe going a little bit full circle about some of what at least I feel are still some of the consequences of COVID and some other interruptions we had and their impact on the dairy industry. So let's start with Cronobacter. Some of you old timers around there might know this organism as ESAC or Enterobacter sakazakii. This organism was reclassified as a new genus, so the genus Cronobacter, which now includes multiple species, Cronobacter sakazakii being one, Cronobacter melonaticus another one, Cronobacter turicensis, after Turin, Italy, another one, and so on. 3 of these species are the primary pathogens. These are the ones that cause most illness cases, but really presence of all Cronobacter in finished infant formula is considered a problem and an adulteration. One of the key things about Cronobacter is that it's very resistant to desiccation, so to drying out, which can explain why it is an issue in infant formula. However, and that's really important, that it's an opportunistic pathogen. That means it's not an organism that causes disease or can cause disease in everyone. It only causes it is when given an opportunity in specific hosts. And the specific hosts here, obviously, infants, and specifically the very, very young infants. It is not considered a pathogen for the general population, which I think is going to be one of the important things. So if you detect, you shouldn't test for Cronobacter, for example, in ice cream, for example, in fluid milk, for example, in cheese, because it's not considered a public health hazard when found in those products. It only is a public health hazard when found in infant formula. Just as a reminder, when we end up with Cronobacter in infant formula, in the infant formula, as it is fed to a baby, there are really sort of 2 key mechanisms of contamination. One of them is in the processing facilities. This is a classic post-pasteurization contamination situation. So, we have our raw ingredients, we pasteurize them, but then after the heat step, Cronobacter recontaminates the product and is found in the finished product. There's some clear requirements for testing finished infant formula for Cronobacter because of this. But the other route of contamination is during preparation, in homes, in hospitals, etc. And there's some very clear evidence that in a number of Cronobacter infections of infants, the contamination actually occurred in the home. So those are the 2 major mechanisms. For food industry, obviously, well, both of them are important, but the one that is largely in their control is in the processing facilities. Now that obviously, applies to infant formula itself, but also applies to product, dairy powders, that might be potentially used as an ingredient in infant formula without any further subsequent heat treatment. So if you would do dry blending. What kinds of illnesses does Cronobacter cause? As I said, in infants, it causes a very severe disease. Sepsis, bloodstream infection, meningitis, brain infection, as many as 40% of infants with Cronobacter meningitis die. The rest of them will still have some potential chronic disease issues because of these brain infections for the rest of their lives. It's an extremely nasty disease. There's no other way of saying it. Now, there's some evidence that Cronobacter in other people in all ages can cause wound infections or urinary tract infections, and sometimes potentially bloodstream infections, but it is not considered a food safety hazard in other products other than infant formula, at least up to this point. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean, some of your customers, some people won't raise concerns about Cronobacter because it was a major issue with the recall we saw. And of course, the recall and the issue we referred to was the recall by Abbott Nutrition. Ultimately, that product was linked to 4 illnesses, 2 deaths. Right where you say is 40% death rate, case mortality rate in this outbreak. There was early on some talk about also some salmonella illness linked to these products. That did not pan out up to this point. There's no evidence that there were also salmonella illnesses linked to this outbreak. This did not just impact the US, and I think this is an important reminder of how recalls like this, outbreaks like this can really impact the dairy industry and food industry broadly. This is a list of the different countries where this formula was distributed to and where that recall led to, in the recalls within those different countries. Here's some information, and then I didn't sort of summarize the whole inspection report on some of the observations in the facility. And I think this is important because it points us towards where we're going to see attention by FDA and potential others. One of them, you did not maintain a building used in the manufacture, processing, packing, or holding of infant formula in a clean and sanitary conditions. So in sanitary conditions, some concerns about, filtration in a filling machine, temperature monitoring, etc. So there was really a slew of concerns in this specific facility linked to this outbreak. This brings up obviously the bigger picture issue. And again, this is an environmental pathogen. One of the key learnings is to make sure you have a robust environmental monitoring and finished product testing program in place if you make infant formula or ingredients. In dry facilities, Cronobacter isn't in general more broadly. So even if you make whey powder or other powders that are used in non-infant formula, our 2 key organisms are Salmonella and Cronobacter. I'm going to predict that this outbreak is not just going to put a microscope on infant formula facilities and suppliers and Cronobacter, but it's probably also going to revisit and put more focus on Salmonella and dry facilities. So if I were in the dairy industry, now would be a good time to review both your Salmonella and your Cronobacter programs, your control programs, your environmental monitoring programs that target these 2 organisms. Now, here's something interesting that happens, and many of you have seen this recall. So there was subsequently, in a recall of beverage products, recalled over, and here correctly sort of over microbial contamination. But some of the early headlines were recalled due to Cronobacter. So when you see it as your first, like as Martin, you've been lying to us for the last 10 minutes because you said it's only an issue with regard to infant formula. Why will we have a Cronobacter recall of these types of beverages if it's not a food safety issue? Well, this was not, in my read, my interpretation of it, this was not an issue of Cronobacter. Yeah, Cronobacter was found in these products, but what it really was that this is an aseptic product that was not appropriately produced and filled. And they happened to find Cronobacter, but if you found Klebsiella, any other gram-negative, the issue would have been the same because it indicated that this product did not meet commercial sterility specifications. That's why it was recalled. It wasn't recalled because it happened to be Cronobacter. Any other vegetative organism whose presence in these aseptic products would indicate post-pasteurization contamination, and the lack of commercial sterility specs would have to be recalled. So we got to be a little bit careful, and I think this sort of illustrates how I'm going to call people, in particular people who write these headlines, jumped on the Cronobacter bandwagon when this really, and I'm happy to have a discussion later on, when this really, in my mind, was not a Cronobacter recall. It was simply an aseptic product that wasn't packaged and produced appropriately. Another thing that this Cronobacter outbreak really illustrates is some of the other consequences you can have. And then I think it's important for the industry at large to think through this. And this is just one representation of what we've seen. So this is a Facebook or a tweet, I can't even know. Social media post from a county health department in West Virginia, where it talks about that homemade baby formula is not safe. And that is definitely what happened as a consequence of this recall. We had people advertising raw goat's milk as in New York, saying it's tested by New York Ag and Market, which is correct. There's some testing done of the raw milk every 3 months. And we see more people using it to feed their babies, and pictures of babies, happy looking babies on raw goat milk, which obviously is a huge risk. So I think it's an important thing to consider going forward, that anytime you have issues like this, there are some other consequences down the line that could actually harm the dairy industry almost more than the outbreak itself. If people were starting to use other products, particularly unpasteurized milk, to feed the babies and infants because of this. So that's what I had on Cronobacter. Just as a sort of comment, Cronobacter is not, unlike COVID, Cronobacter is not an emerging disease. It's been around for a while. We've always known, not always, we've known for a long time that it causes issues in infants. So this is not a new emerging organism, really. Another thing that some people struggle, and that was obviously high in the news over the last few months, is monkeypox. Here's the current state of where we are. Worldwide, a little bit more than 60,000 cases, 20 deaths. We just recently had the headlines that we had the first death due to monkeypox in the US, which was in California. New York, but mainly New York City, has a second largest number of monkeypox cases in the US. We should not think this is a second COVID, and I think people by and large don't. It's much less deadly, much less transmissible than COVID. Just going to get it by being coughed on, etc. So it's something to keep our eyes out for as an industry, but again, much less severe, much less of a potential issue for the food industry and for total public health than COVID. In response to monkeypox, we did actually put out a short fact sheet that specifically sort of provides advice to the food industry. What, if anything, to do, what are the issues around monkeypox. It is available on our webpage. Maybe Al or Beth can put a link in there for people to find this one. And I want to cite sort of one key thing. I mean, there's a theoretical possibility of transmissions through foods and food packaging, and all data we see actually indicate that transmissions through food packaging is probably higher than the risk was for COVID-19. To be perfectly honest. But basic practices that you need to follow in food processing facilities anyway, good manufacturing practices, will effectively control this small risk of food-associated transmission. So both from a workforce impact, rather than a potential panic factor, and from a foodborne transmission route, less of an issue than COVID-19. But it doesn't mean food industry shouldn't do anything. Here's some of the things that we think would make sense. One question would be to provide some basic training on monkeypox, how to identify an infection. These was a recommendation we put out a few weeks ago. I'm personally not sure at this point. The way this is going is that it really is needed. But reinforcing GMPs and general disease control procedures is probably a good idea. Yeah, we've done a lot of that during COVID, but I think people are probably sliding back a little bit. Reinforcing proper hand washing, PPEs is important. And then again, it probably is a good idea to have a protocol what to do when an employee has an active monkeypox infection. At the very least, know where your resources are so that if this issue occurs in one of the employees in your facility, you're prepared. You're not starting from ground zero. By being on these office hours, you're already halfway there because you know there's a fact sheet, and that gives you some ideas and gives you some help to how to deal with this. At this point, at least we feel like, and I haven't seen anyone that recommend that either, is there's no need to pursue strategies to assure vaccination of food workers, etc. It is really just a question of reinforcing general GMPs is what is sufficient, with the possibility of doing some specific training. But again, if it's my facility, particularly if I'm not in a high risk area, which upstate New York would not be, I will probably not do any training at this point. So these are the two sort of emerging, re-emerging, hot button infectious disease issues that I wanted to cover here today. Next one, we're going to move into sanitizer contamination of milk. And that's sort of, at least for some people, shook us in terms of what we saw there, because within a couple of weeks, there were two issues where school milk had sanitizers in it. One of them was in New Jersey, Camden City School District. The other one was Boston Public Schools. And I think all of us in the dairy industry sort of know how this could happen. You have some residual sanitizer in the system and in the bowls of the filler. And it can and might be in some of the first cartons that come out. There should be procedures in place to avoid that. But speculating there, but potentially with COVID-19, new employees focus on so many other things. Our procedures just weren't as enforced in terms of preventing this from happening. Now, this is not just a dairy industry issue. We saw more recently the same issue in Capri Sun, cleaning solution, contamination, those products. So this is broadly filling and beverage operations is a challenge. It shouldn't be a big challenge. The procedures are fairly straightforward to prevent this in terms of making sure that the product comes off the line, is tasted to assure that there is no issue. Industry actions, definitely time, if you have not done it, to review your procedures that are used to prevent this, to determine whether the product does not contain sanitizer or does contain sanitizer. If this is individual tasting the milk, whether it's your filler operator, your lab, A, make sure it really happens, and B, make sure these people are qualified and trained to do this properly. In conversations we had, some concerns about, if this is the line operator that starts at 4 a.m, in an environment where there's a lot of sanitizer smells to begin with, are they really able to sensitively detect this issue? Or would they miss contamination that would be easily picked up by school children that have much more sensitive taste buds? So this is something industry needs to look at, and probably beyond the dairy industry, probably also beyond fluid milk in other parts of the dairy industry. I think this is not a new issue. We've seen this issue before. It was just that combination of two within a couple of weeks that was really unusual. But definitely a reminder of what needs to be done here. Fourth thing I want to briefly cover is supply chain issues. And typically when we talked about this during COVID, we talked about ingredients. But there are other issues that we have seen, we have observed, and have confirmed this with some people in the industry we talked about that I think are important for people to be aware of. Obviously, ingredients and raw materials, obviously packaging materials, but what I don't focus on is really the impact on lab testing and lab supplies. Not surprising, COVID-19 obviously used a lot of supplies for testing, whether this is from the basic lab supplies, such as pipette tips, anything that your labs are using to test your samples, whether it's for coliforms, Listeria, Salmonella, or Cronobacter. We had seen multiple incidences where a company that produced the testing kits for pathogens must have had some issues because some of the test kits did not perform appropriately. Some of the test kits had a higher number of false positives. So samples in a rapid kit tested positive as for Salmonella, let's say, and it really wasn't Salmonella positive because there were issues with the supplies, most likely because there were issues with the supplies that were used to manufacture those kits. And therefore the kits did not perform appropriately. And often it was not detected in the QA, QC that these manufacturers of these test kits do, but it was discovered by the end users. There were some weaknesses in terms of communicating this. In a number of cases, multiple food companies each had to individually discover that there was a problem with a specific test kit, and it was not broadly communicated. So I'm the last person that wants to blame the lab for a positive test for a foodborne pathogen, but over the last year or so, we have seen a few issues like that. So something to be aware of, that your suppliers, your supporting industries, such as the testing labs, were not immune. They had the same issues as you, and it had and can have impact on their operations, and it did, as we saw. This goes beyond the supplies, workforce issues, just the same workforce issues you had, labs had, and other supporting services had. We have seen, and this is a consequence of whole genome sequencing in general, that we have become more aware of when samples are cross-contaminated in labs, where you can see that two samples from, let's say, different customers, both positive for Salmonella, and it's exactly the same Salmonella, which if it comes from two different facilities making completely different products, probably doesn't make sense. Not probably, it doesn't make sense, and it indicates cross-contamination from lab test strains. All of these issues we've seen. We've seen some labs cutting corners, not confirming, not doing confirmation procedures. That then makes it even difficult for us to go back and determine what really happened, because some of the labs did not do their full job. So take-home message here, it's probably time to re-review the labs you're using, review their procedures. If you haven't had a conversation with your lab, seeing how they're operating, whether they have the resources needed. Until before COVID, it might be time to re-evaluate that. For those of you doing own lab testing, or even if you want to recommend it to something, shameless plug, we're going to do a hands-on lab workshop early January. If you're interested, contact any of us. We will also further announce this in our Dairy Foods Extension newsletter. So where does all of this leave us? These various sort of bits and pieces of things that happened over the last 6 to 8 months. I think number one is, review your environmental monitoring program, assess whether it needs to address Cronobacter risks. More broadly, if you manufacture any dry products, dry dairy products in particular, don't just think about Cronobacter, also think about Salmonella. GMPs, reinforcing GMPs, retraining on GMPs. Yes, we did that during COVID-19. But sort of monkeypox taught us that it's probably time to do this again, maybe with some slightly different focus, but it's important. Have a plan for monkeypox, at least know where you can get information. Depending on where you are, what you deem the risk is to your operation, maybe doing some specific training. Doesn't have to be long, but should address, how to detect an infection, what to do when you have an infection, etc. Reviewing startup procedures with a focus related to those preventing sanitizer contamination, and review your labs. Another point that I didn't make is, so many of you will use rapid tests, PCR-based tests, molecular tests, whatever you want to call them. And what sometimes happens is that a molecular test will be positive, So it's typically reported as a presumptive positive. But then the confirmation procedure, which should be done, so first of all, make sure that confirmation procedure is done, does not confirm. So we have a rapid test positive, a classical method not confirming, which is what we call do not confirm results. And these can occur, but they should not occur at a high frequency. And what I strongly encourage you to sort of have this conversation to your labs. Do you have KPIs, key performance indicators on do not confirms? And because this can help you identify false positive results. This can identify issues with both the manufacturers of the kits that are used, suppliers, as well as internally the lab and the lab confirmation procedures. So to dig a little bit deeper, whether your labs are doing these things, whether they keep in metrics, and whether you can review these metrics to really see that they're performing at the level you need them to perform, is probably a good idea. Something I would do right now if I were in the shoes of those that are responsible for or run a dairy processing facility or dairy company that relies on these test results. So that's what I had for today. Ready to open it up for discussions, questions, input, etc.